The wind in western Kansas does not blow. It scrapes. It moves across the flat, unbroken plains with a steady grinding indifference, carrying the dust of 1,000 failed harvests and the quiet desperation of men who have tied their blood to the dirt. In the autumn of 2019, that wind felt colder than usual in Oak Haven County. It carried the smell of dry earth and the bitter reality of a wheat market that was slowly bleeding the life out of every family farm within 100 miles. Silas Hayes sat at the kitchen table long before the sun even thought about breaking the horizon. The farmhouse was dark silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a wall clock that had hung in the exact same spot since his grandfather bought it in 1952. Silas was 56 years old. He carried the weight of those years in the deep lines around his eyes and the permanent ache in his knuckles. He was a man made of quiet routines and hard labor, a man who understood the language of rain and soil far better than the language of other men. In front of him, illuminated by a single yellow bulb hanging from the ceiling, sat a piece of heavy white paper. It was a letter from the county bank. It was not the first letter, but it was the one that mattered. The numbers printed in crisp black ink did not care about the 4 generations of Hayes men who had broken their backs on this land. The numbers did not care about the bad weather in 2017 or the global supply glut in 2018. The numbers only demanded to be settled. If they were not settled by the end of the next harvest cycle, the bank would take the Pine Ridge tract. Pine Ridge was the heart of the farm. If Pine Ridge went, the rest of the operation would collapse like a barn with a broken spine. Silas folded the letter exactly in half edge to edge and then folded it again. He pressed his heavy thumb along the crease. He did not curse. He did not throw his coffee cup against the wall. Men like Silas did not afford themselves the luxury of useless anger. They simply absorbed the blow, tightened their jaw, and walked out into the dark to do the work anyway. He picked up his worn canvas jacket from the back of the chair and stepped out onto the porch. The gravel crunched under the tires of a heavy truck turning off the county road and up the long driveway. Silas watched the headlights cut through the early morning gloom. It was his daughter. Evelyn Hayes had driven straight through the night from the university. She was 22 years old, built lean and tough like her father, with the same sharp, observing eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She killed the engine and stepped out of the cab. The wind immediately whipped her hair across her face. She didn't bother pulling a suitcase from the back. She only reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a battered, thick spiral notebook. Silas stood on the porch, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He looked at the truck. He looked at his daughter. He nodded once. That was the greeting. It was all that was needed. They sat in the kitchen as the gray light of dawn slowly bled through the windows. Evelyn poured a cup of black coffee and set the spiral notebook on the table right next to where the folded bank letter rested. She knew about the letter. She knew about the debt. She had spent the last 4 years studying agronomy and agricultural economics, but she did not need a university degree to know that the traditional way of farming winter wheat in Oak Haven County was a slow march toward bankruptcy. You planted in the fall. You prayed for moisture. You watched the green shoots fight through the winter. You harvested in June. You sold the grain to the local elevator for whatever price the market dictated. That was the rhythm. That was the religion of the county. You did not question it. Evelyn opened the notebook. The pages were filled with dense columns of numbers, handwritten charts, and meticulous calculations. She looked across the table at her father. He looked tired. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for the wind to push him over. "I have a plan," she said. Her voice was steady, calm, betraying none of the exhaustion from the long drive. Silas looked at the notebook. He did not ask what the plan was. He waited. "We bring in cattle," Evelyn said. "We buy 40 head of stocker steers. We put them out on the winter wheat next month. We let them graze the crop." The silence that followed was absolute. The ticking of the wall clock suddenly sounded very loud. Silas stared at his daughter. He was a patient man, but he was also a man who possessed a deep inherent respect for the rules of the land. What she was suggesting was not just a new method. In Oak Haven County, it was considered agricultural sabotage. You did not let heavy trampling hooves anywhere near a newly planted vulnerable wheat crop. It went against everything 4 generations of Hayes men had bled into the soil. "You want to put cattle on the winter wheat," Silas repeated. The words tasted wrong in his mouth. "I want to graze them through the vegetative stage," Evelyn said, her finger tracing a line of data in the notebook. "If we manage the rotation properly, if we move them using temporary electric fencing, before the plant reaches the jointing stage in late winter, the wheat will recover. The grazing pressure actually stimulates the root system. The cattle gain weight on free forage, saving us thousands in winter feed costs. We sell the cattle in the spring for a profit, and we still harvest the grain in June. Dual purpose. Two paychecks from the same dirt. Silas rubbed a rough hand over his face. He looked out the window toward the rolling fields of dark earth that had just been seeded. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about the bank letter. "The cattle will eat the profit to the ground," Silas said, his voice low. "They will trample the crowns. The soil will pack. The wheat won't bounce back. We will have nothing to cut in June." "Not if we pull them off in time," Evelyn countered. She pushed the notebook across the table. "I have 50 years of university trial data here. I have the weight gain conversions. I have the yield penalty calculations. Even if the wheat yield drops by 10%, the weight the cattle put on covers the loss and nets us a margin we haven't seen in a decade. We are bleeding money trying to grow grain alone. We are one bad freeze away from losing Pine Ridge. We cannot afford to do what we have always done." Silas looked down at the numbers. He was not an educated man in the academic sense, but he could read a ledger. He could see the logic. But logic on paper and reality in the dirt were two entirely different things. He knew the land. The land did not read university trials. The land was cruel and unforgiving. "Let me think on it," Silas finally said. He stood up, took his hat from the peg by the door, and walked out to the barn. He left the notebook on the table. He left the bank letter next to it. For a week, nothing more was said. Silas worked the farm. Evelyn worked beside him. They repaired fences, greased the tractor joints, and hauled winter hay. The unspoken tension hung between them like a physical weight. Evelyn knew her father was fighting a war inside his own head. It was a war between the desperate need to save the farm and the terrifying prospect of breaking the very traditions that defined his existence. But in a small, tight-knit farming community, secrets do not live long. Words carry on the wind. It started with a casual conversation at the feed store, a question asked about temporary electric fencing, a slip of the tongue. Within days, the rumor had spread across Oak Haven County. Silas Hayes's girl had come back from college with some crazy idea to turn cows loose on the winter wheat. Vance Corlin heard the rumor on a Tuesday. Vance was 61 years old, a man carved from the very establishment of the county. He owned the largest agricultural supply and feed business in the region. He drove a pristine silver truck and wore clothes that were always clean, the mark of a man who made money off the sweat of others rather than his own. Vance knew every farmer by name, knew their debts, knew their yields. His word carried the weight of gospel in the county. When Vance Corland offered advice, you took it. When he frowned at a practice, you stopped doing it. On a gray Thursday morning, Evelyn was out near the edge of the county road, measuring the distance for the temporary polywire fence she planned to build. The sky was the color of bruised iron, threatening a cold rain. The dirt under her boots was hard. The silver truck slowed down as it approached. It pulled over to the shoulder tires, crunching loudly on the gravel. The passenger window rolled down. Vance Corland leaned across the seat. He rested his arm on the window frame. He did not look angry. He looked entirely amused, which was far worse. "Morning," Evelyn Vance called out. His voice was thick and carrying. Evelyn stopped measuring. She stood up straight, holding the fiberglass fence post like a spear. "Morning, Mr. Corland. I hear you're pricing out some electric wire," Vance said, letting his eyes drift over the vast, newly planted wheat field behind her. "I hear you've got a notion to run stockers out here on this fresh crop." "Word travels fast," Evelyn said evenly. Vance chuckled. It was a deep, chest-rattling sound. It wasn't a malicious laugh, but it was dripping with the condescension of a man who believes he is watching a child play with matches. "Well, they teach a lot of interesting things up at the university. Fancy theories for fancy people. But dirt is dirt, Evelyn. You put a 1,000-pound animal on a fragile wheat chute in November, you ain't going to have anything to put a combine through in June. You're going to turn your daddy's best ground into a mud pit." "The data says otherwise," Evelyn replied. Her voice did not shake. She looked directly into Vance's eyes. "If you manage the stocking density and track the growing point of the plant, the root system strengthens." Vance stopped smiling. The amusement vanished, replaced by the cold, hard authority of a man whose expertise was being challenged by someone he considered a novice. "Data," he said, dragging the word out slowly. "Data doesn't pay the bank, little girl. Grain pays the bank. Your father is a good man. He's struggling. We all know it. Don't you go ruining what little he has left with some textbook fantasy. He rolled the window up before she could answer. The silver truck pulled away, kicking up a cloud of white dust that washed over Evelyn. She stood perfectly still, the fiberglass post gripping tightly in her hands. The laugh echoed in her mind. It was not just Vance Corland laughing. It was the whole county. It was the sound of 100 years of stubborn pride refusing to see a different way forward. By the end of the week, the consequences of that interaction began to materialize. Oak Haven County was a place governed by reputation. A man's reputation was his currency. If the community decided a man had lost his senses, the community quietly closed its doors. Silas walked into the local diner on Saturday morning, just as he had done every Saturday for 30 years. The diner was the heartbeat of the county, a place of scuffed linoleum floors and the smell of strong coffee and fried bacon. The booths were filled with men in flannel shirts and seed caps. Usually when Silas walked in, hands would raise. Greetings would be called out. Chairs would scrape back to make room. This morning, as the little bell above the door jingled, the diner went noticeably quiet. Conversations dropped to a murmur. A few men looked up, met Silas's eyes, and then quickly looked back down at their coffee cups. Nobody waved. Nobody made room. In the back booth, holding court as he always did, sat Vance Corland. Vance looked at Silas. He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. It was a gesture of profound pity. It was the look you give a man who has lost his mind and is dragging his family down with him. Silas stood frozen near the entrance. He felt the heat rise in his neck. He was a proud man. He had never begged. He had never shirked a debt. He had worked his fingers to the bone to keep the Hayes name clean and respected. And now, because he was entertaining the ideas of his daughter, he was being treated like a fool. He was being shunned. The local fertilizer dealer, a man Silas had known since childhood, caught his eye and gave a small, uncomfortable grimace before turning away. The message was clear. The county had decided. The Hayes farm was a sinking ship being steered by a reckless girl and a weak father. Silas did not order his coffee. He turned around and walked out into the cold morning air. When he returned to the farmhouse, his face was set in stone. He walked into the kitchen. Evelyn was at the table, her notebook open, reviewing her rotational grazing schedules. She looked up and immediately saw the storm in her father's eyes. The quiet dignity he usually carried had been stripped away, replaced by a raw, simmering desperation. Silas walked past her. He went into the mudroom and pulled open the heavy steel drawer of his filing cabinet. He rustled through a stack of old, yellowed property maps. He found the one he was looking for, walked back into the kitchen, and slammed it down flat on the table right over Evelyn's notebook. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at a specific section on the far western edge of the map. "The Miller Tract," Silas said. His voice was ragged. It sounded like tearing canvas. Evelyn stared at the map. The Miller Tract. It was 160 acres of the worst dirt in Oak Haven County. It was a piece of land they had acquired decades ago in a trade, and it had been a curse ever since. The soil was thin, sandy, and prone to blowing away in the spring winds. It held no moisture. It possessed no nutrients. It was a graveyard of ambition. Generations of farmers had tried to coax a decent crop out of the Miller Tract, and every single one of them had failed. It was the land you ignored. It was the land you wished you didn't own. "You want to run your experiment," Silas said, leaning over the table, his eyes locked on hers. "You want to prove the university right and the whole damn county wrong. You do it there." Evelyn looked at the map, then up at her father. "Dad, the Miller Tract is dead soil. The wheat barely establishes there in a good year. If I put cattle on it, the margin of error is zero. If there's a drought, if there's a hard freeze, there is no buffer. The land won't forgive a single mistake." "I know what it is," Silas snapped. His voice rose, the suppressed humiliation of the diner finally breaking through. "I know exactly what it is. And I know that Vance Corland is sitting in town right now telling every man who will listen that I've lost my grip. I have a bank letter sitting in that drawer that says I lose Pine Ridge in 8 months. I am fighting for the survival of my father's name. I cannot risk the home ground. I will not let you destroy the good soil on a gamble." He tapped his finger hard against the map. "You get the Miller Tract," he said. 160 acres. You buy the fencing. You buy the cattle. You manage the water. You do it all yourself. If you fail out there where nobody can see it. And if you ruin the crop, we lose a crop we weren't going to make money on anyway." The reality of the burden crashed down on Evelyn. She was not just being asked to prove a theory. She was being asked to perform a miracle on barren ground, completely isolated, with zero margin for error. Her father was not giving her a chance to succeed. He was giving her a contained space to fail, hoping that when she did, she would finally accept the hard, bitter truth of how the world really worked. He was trying to protect the rest of the farm by sacrificing her pride on the worst piece of dirt they owned. Evelyn looked at the lines on her father's face. She saw the fear. She saw the exhaustion. She understood what it had cost him to walk out of that diner. He was a man backed into a corner by the modern world, fighting ghosts he couldn't see and debts he couldn't outrun. He needed her to be wrong so the rules he had lived by his entire life would still make sense. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She slowly reached out, took her spiral notebook from under the map and closed it. "I will take the Miller tract," Evelyn said quietly. Her voice was pure steel. Silas stood up straight. The anger drained out of him, leaving only a hollow emptiness. He looked at his daughter standing small but unbreakable in the dim kitchen light. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. He wanted to tell her he loved her, but the words were trapped behind a lifetime of silence. He turned and walked back out the door into the cold, scraping wind. The next morning, the real work began. Evelyn drove her truck out to the Miller tract. It was miles from the main farmhouse, accessible only by a deeply rutted dirt road that turned to soup in the rain and concrete in the dry heat. She stood at the edge of the field. The winter wheat had been drilled 2 weeks prior. The shoots were just barely breaking the surface, a faint, fragile green mist against the pale, sandy dirt. It looked pathetic. The soil felt like ash beneath her boots. She bent down, digging her fingers into the earth. It was dry. There was no structure, no organic matter holding it together. It was dirt that had forgotten how to live. To run cattle out here, she needed water. The Miller tract had no natural creek, no functioning well. There was an old rusted stock tank near the far fence line, half filled with tumbleweeds and dead leaves. She would have to haul water every single day in a poly tank in the back of her truck. Hundreds of gallons miles down the rutted road in the freezing dawn and the fading dusk. She needed fencing. The perimeter fence was ancient barbed wire, sagging and broken in a dozen places. To manage the grazing to keep the cattle from destroying the wheat, she had to build a maze of temporary internal paddocks using highly conductive polywire and step-in fiberglass posts. She had to divide the barren 160 acres into precise sections, moving the cattle every few days to ensure they only took the top leafy growth of the plant and left the vital growing crown intact. It was a logistical nightmare, and she had to fund it herself. Evelyn drove back into town that afternoon. She did not go to Vance Corlin's supply store. She would not give him the satisfaction of denying her credit or laughing in her face again. She drove straight past his gleaming building and parked in front of the small, struggling, independent hardware store on the edge of the county line. She walked in and placed her order on the counter. 4 rolls of heavy-duty polywire, 300 step-in posts, a solar-powered fence energizer, 2 portable mineral feeders. The old man behind the counter tallied up the total. It was a sum that made Evelyn's stomach tighten. She pulled out a faded leather wallet. She extracted a stack of bills she had saved from working overnight shifts at the university agronomy lab for the last 3 years. Money she had meant to use to start her own life. She handed it over. Every last dollar. She spent the next week out on the Miller tract alone. She worked from the moment the sun cracked the horizon until the shadows swallowed the land. The wind was relentless, biting through her canvas coat, stinging her eyes with blown sand. She walked miles unrolling spools of white polywire, driving the fiberglass posts into the hard, unforgiving earth. She calculated the geometry of the paddocks based on the estimated dry matter intake of 40 steers. She measured. She adjusted. She built a highly engineered system of grazing management on a piece of land that everyone else had abandoned. Sometimes a neighbor would drive past on the distant county road. They would slow down. They would watch the young woman walking alone across the barren dirt, stringing up thin white wire like spider webs. They would shake their heads and drive on. The isolation was absolute. She was a ghost working on a graveyard. When the internal fences were built, she needed the cattle. She drove her truck in the gooseneck trailer 2 counties over to an independent livestock auction. She didn't buy the best-looking calves. She couldn't afford them. She bought 40 head of crossbred stocker steers. They were a little rough, a little uneven, weighing an average of 600 pounds each. They were the kind of cattle that needed good forage to turn a profit. She loaded them into the trailer. The smell of manure and diesel smoke filled the air. As she drove the heavy load back toward Oak Haven County, the reality of what she had done settled over her like a heavy blanket. All her money was gone. She was responsible for 40 lives. She was responsible for a crop on dead soil. And she was carrying the weight of her father's crumbling pride. It was late afternoon when she pulled the trailer through the rusted gate of the Miller tract. The sky was the color of slate, cold and indifferent. She backed the trailer up to the first paddock she had built. She unlatched the heavy metal gate of the trailer. The steers hesitated for a moment, smelling the unfamiliar wind. Then one by one they stepped down the ramp. Their hooves hit the dry dirt. They spread out, lowering their heads, sniffing the faint green shoots of the young winter wheat. Evelyn stood by the trailer, holding her breath. This was the moment of truth. The theory was becoming reality. The cattle did not stampede. They did not tear the plants out by the roots. They simply began to eat. They took the tips of the green leaves, their rough tongues sweeping across the surface, pulling the forage in with a steady, rhythmic tearing sound. Evelyn watched them. She watched the way their hooves impacted the soil. She watched how much plant matter they left behind. She pulled the spiral notebook from her coat pocket. Her hands were numb from the cold. She uncapped a pen and wrote down the date. She wrote down the turnout time. She wrote down the estimated initial forage height. She was no longer a student. She was a manager of land and life. Over the next month, the Miller tract became her entire universe. The routine was brutal and unyielding. She rose at 4 in the morning. She drove the poly tank to the farmhouse, well filling it with freezing water in the dark. She drove the slow, treacherous miles to the tract. She hauled 5-gallon buckets of water from the truck to the stock tank until her shoulders screamed and her hands blistered inside her gloves. Then came the moves. Every 3 days, the cattle had to be moved to a fresh paddock to prevent overgrazing. This meant reeling up hundreds of yards of temporary wire, pulling up posts, walking the new boundary, driving the post back into the frozen dirt, and reeling the wire back out. She did this while the cattle bawled in anticipation, pushing against the lines. She got down on her hands and knees in the dirt every single day. She used a small wooden ruler to measure the height of the remaining wheat stubble. She dug her fingers into the soil to check the moisture. She examined the crowns of the wheat plants to ensure the growing point had not been damaged by a heavy hoof. It was a delicate, exhausting dance. If she left the cattle on a paddock one day too long, they would eat into the crown and the plant would die. If she moved them too fast, they wouldn't put on enough weight and the profit margin would vanish. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological toll was heavier. November brought a bitter, dry cold. The landscape turned brittle. The wheat on the Miller tract, grazed down by the cattle, looked awful. To the untrained eye, it looked like a disaster. It looked like 40 animals had been turned loose to destroy a field. Silas drove out to the Miller tract once during that first month. He parked his truck by the gate. He didn't get out. He just sat behind the steering wheel, looking through the windshield at the chewed-up, ragged field. Evelyn was out in the distance walking a fence line. She saw him. She didn't wave. She just kept walking. Silas sat there for 10 minutes, watching the ruin of his daughter's ambition. Then he put the truck in reverse and drove away. He didn't come back. In town, the whispers grew louder. The men at the diner reported what they saw when they drove past. "She's killed it," they said. "It looks like a feedlot out there. Not a blade of grass over 2 inches high. Silas is a fool for letting her do it." Vance Corland heard the reports. He smiled his slow, confident smile. He knew he was right. The natural order of things was reasserting itself. You don't fight the dirt. You don't fight tradition. The girl was learning a hard lesson, and the Hayes family would pay the price. He felt a twinge of genuine pity for Silas, but it was overshadowed by the deep satisfaction of his own vindication. Evelyn heard the rumors, too, relayed by her mother, Martha. Martha was a quiet woman, a woman who observed much and spoke little. She would pack sandwiches for Evelyn and leave them on the kitchen counter in the dark mornings. She never told Evelyn to stop. She just made sure she had enough food to keep going. "Let them talk," Evelyn told herself as she hauled another heavy bucket of freezing water across the frozen ground. "Let them talk. The scale doesn't lie." She had borrowed a portable livestock scale from the university extension office. Every 2 weeks, she ran a sample group of the steers across the aluminum platform. The cattle were gaining weight. The winter wheat, despite looking ragged, was incredibly nutrient-dense. The protein content was high. The steers were converting the forage into muscle at a rate of 2.2 pounds per day. It was working. The math was holding. The cattle were growing on land that was supposed to be dead on feed that cost nothing but her own breaking back. But Evelyn knew the true test had not yet arrived. The university data was gathered in controlled environments with average weather patterns. Oak Haven County did not care about averages. Oak Haven County was a place of extremes. The sky was vast and unpredictable, capable of delivering salvation or destruction without a moment's notice. As November bled into December, the temperature began to drop steadily. The wind shifted, blowing down from the north with a sharp, biting edge that cut right to the bone. The ground froze solid, turning the dirt into concrete. Evelyn watched the sky. She listened to the weather radio in her truck cab every night. The voice crackled over the static, talking about a massive Arctic front moving down across the plains. It wasn't just a snowstorm, it was a flash freeze. A sudden, catastrophic drop in temperature that could take the air from 30 degrees down to zero in a matter of hours, accompanied by driving ice. She sat in the cab of her truck, the heater blowing weakly, her hands wrapped around a thermos of lukewarm coffee. The spiral notebook rested on her lap. She opened it to the section on winter weather protocols. The data was clear. Winter wheat is highly resilient to cold. As long as the growing point remains below the soil surface, the plant goes into dormancy and survives the freeze. The leaves may burn back, but the plant will live. The book said to leave the cattle on the pasture. Moving them would cause unnecessary stress, and they could ride out the storm as long as they had access to water. That was what the book said. But Evelyn looked out the windshield at the Miller tract. The soil here was not university soil. It was sand. It was dust. It had no insulating layer of organic matter. The crowns of the wheat plants were shallow. If the temperature dropped to zero and the ground shifted with the deep freeze, the structure of the fragile soil would shatter. And if 40 steers weighing 700 pounds each were walking over that shattered, freezing soil, their hooves would not just pack the dirt. Their hooves would act like hammers, driving the cold straight down into the shallow crowns of the plants. The ice, combined with the mechanical damage of the hooves in a flash freeze, would kill the growing point. The wheat would not go dormant, it would die. The crop would be annihilated. The panic was a cold, hard knot in her chest. She had a choice to make. She could follow the data. She could trust the university professors who had written the manuals in warm offices hundreds of miles away. Or she could trust her own eyes, her own understanding of this specific, miserable piece of land. The sky outside the windshield was turning a strange, bruised purple. The wind was picking up, rocking the heavy truck on its suspension. The temperature gauge on the dashboard was dropping visibly. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The storm was coming faster than predicted. Evelyn threw the truck into gear. She didn't drive home. She drove her truck straight into the Miller tract, the tires bouncing wildly over the frozen ruts. She pulled up to the paddock where the cattle were currently grazing. The steers were bunched together, their heads down, sensing the approaching violence in the air. Evelyn grabbed a heavy pair of wire cutters from the glove box. She stepped out into the wind. It hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. The cold was instantaneous and savage. She did not follow the manual. She abandoned the book. She ran to the temporary fence line. She didn't bother reeling it in carefully. She used the heavy cutters and severed the polywire. She grabbed the fiberglass posts and ripped them out of the frozen ground, throwing them aside. She tore open a wide gap in the containment area. She ran back to the truck and laid on the horn. The blaring sound cut through the howling wind. She yelled, her voice tearing from her throat. "Hup, move out!" She waded into the herd, waving her arms, slapping the heavy flanks of the steers. They were confused, hesitant. They didn't want to move into the teeth of the rising storm. "Move," Evelyn screamed, picking up a frozen clod of dirt and hurling it at the lead steer. Slowly, reluctantly, the herd began to shift. Evelyn pushed them. She ran behind them, slipping on the frozen earth, her lungs burning with the freezing air. She drove them away from the wheat, away from the fragile, shallow soil. At the far edge of the Miller tract, near the rusted entrance gate, there was a small 2-acre patch of native buffalo grass. It was tough, thick, and deeply rooted. It was the only part of the 160 acres that wasn't planted with wheat. It offered no nutritional value, but the ground was hard as iron and the roots formed a thick mat. Evelyn drove the 40 steers onto that small patch of native grass. She ran to the truck, grabbed the remaining spools of wire, and frantically strung a tight, crude containment pen around them, tying the wire off to the rusting perimeter fence posts. She didn't use step-in posts. The ground was too hard. She wrapped the wire around whatever scrub brush or old wood she could find. By the time she finished, the sun was gone. The sky had collapsed. The flash freeze hit with terrifying speed. The air turned into a wall of driving microscopic ice crystals. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in 30 minutes. Evelyn stood by the truck, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her fingers were completely numb. Her eyelashes were frozen together. She looked at the cattle huddled tightly together in a massive dark knot on the native grass, their backs turning white with ice. She looked out over the dark expanse of the wheat field. The wind was screaming across the barren dirt. The freeze was locking the soil down, turning it into a brittle shell. If the cattle had been out there tonight, walking seeking shelter, pacing the fence lines in the storm, they would have ground the crowns of the wheat into powder. They would have destroyed it all. Evelyn climbed into the freezing cab of the truck. She turned the key. The engine turned over, sluggishly whining in the extreme cold before finally catching. She turned the heater on high, though it only blew cold air for a long time. She sat there in the dark, shivering violently, listening to the storm hammer against the metal of the truck. She had abandoned her data. She had acted on instinct. She had made a massive gamble in the dark. If the wheat died anyway from the cold, she was ruined. If the cattle broke through the crude fence and got lost in the storm, she was ruined. She curled her numb hands around the steering wheel and rested her forehead against her knuckles. For the first time since she had returned to Oak Haven County, the sheer, crushing weight of the isolation broke through her armor. A single hot tear escaped her eye and froze almost instantly on her cheek. She was completely alone in the storm. The town was laughing at her. Her father was waiting for her to fail. And the land was trying to kill everything she was trying to save. The wind howled outside, sounding exactly like a laugh. Evelyn did not go home that night. She stayed in the truck, idling the engine periodically to keep from freezing to death, keeping her eyes fixed on the dark mass of huddled cattle through the driving ice. The dawn broke over Oak Haven County, not with a gradual warming light, but with a harsh, blinding glare reflecting off a world locked in solid ice. The wind had finally died down, leaving behind a silence so absolute it rang in the ears. Inside the cab of the truck, Evelyn Hayes forced her eyes open. Her breath plumed in the freezing air of the interior. The heater had given up hours ago. Her joints screamed in protest as she pushed open the heavy metal door. Her boots hit the frozen ground with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil. She walked toward the native grass patch. The 40-stalker steers were still there. They were clustered tight, a living wall of body heat, their dark coats dusted with frost. As she approached, the lead steer lifted his heavy head and let out a low rumbling breath. They were cold. They were hungry. But they were alive. Evelyn turned and looked across the Miller tract. The 160 acres of winter wheat lay under a thin, glittering crust of ice. It looked like a wasteland. It looked exactly like what Vance Corland had predicted, a ruined field of dead dreams. She walked out into the middle of the tract. She dropped to her knees. The cold seeped instantly through her heavy denim jeans. She pulled a heavy fixed blade knife from her belt and drove it into the earth. The soil was like concrete. She had to chip away at it piece by piece, digging a small jagged hole down to the base of a wheat plant. She pulled the plant free, brushing the frozen dirt away with her numb thumb. She looked closely at the crown, the vital intersection between root and shoot. It was pale, it was cold, but it was firm. There was a microscopic tinge of vivid living green buried deep within the core. The hooves had not crushed it. The freeze had burned the upper leaves, turning them a brittle, translucent brown, but the heart of the plant had survived. Because she had pulled the heavy animals off the fragile sandy soil before the ice hit the earth, had not been pulverized into the crowns. The plant had safely entered dormancy. Evelyn closed her eyes. She let her forehead drop to the frozen earth. She stayed there for a long time, listening to the slow, steady beating of her own heart. The winter ground on slow and bitter. Evelyn maintained her brutal routine. When the ground thawed enough to bear the weight, without shattering the crowns, she moved the cattle back onto the wheat. She weighed them. She moved the fences. She hauled the water. She did not go into town. She did not listen to the whispers. Then came the spring of 2020. The great thaw arrived. The ice retreated. The sun warmed the dirt, and the Miller tract woke up. The plants that had looked dead and beaten suddenly exploded with life. Because the cattle had grazed the top growth in the fall, the plants had not wasted energy maintaining excess foliage through the winter. Instead, they tillered. They sent out multiple shoots from the base, growing thicker, denser, and more aggressive than a conventional stand. The field turned a deep, rich, violent green that stood out against the pale landscape of the county like an emerald dropped in the dust. In late March, before the wheat reached the critical joining stage, Evelyn pulled the cattle off the miller track for the final time. She loaded them into the gooseneck trailer and drove them to the sale barn. She sat in the hard wooden bleachers of the auction house. The auctioneer's voice was a rapid-fire staccato. Her 40 steers were driven into the ring. They did not look rough anymore. They were thick, broad-shouldered, and slick-haired. They had gained an average of 2.1 pounds per day through the dead of winter on land the county called worthless. The hammer fell. The price was high. Evelyn walked out of the auction house with a check in her pocket that represented more pure profit than the Miller tract had produced in 30 years combined. But the dual-purpose system was only half complete. She still had to harvest the grain. June arrived with the heavy, dry heat of the Kansas summer. Silas Hayes drove his old rattling John Deere combine out to the Miller tract. He had not spoken of the field since the day he threw the map on the kitchen table. He engaged the header and drove into the standing wheat. When the harvest was finished and the grain was weighed at the local elevator, the numbers were absolute. The Miller tract yielded 42 bushels to the acre. The county average that year for conventional ungrazed wheat on good soil was 45. Evelyn had taken a minor 3-bushel yield penalty, but she had already cashed a massive check for the cattle. That night, Silas sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. He had the elevator receipts on one side of his coffee cup and the cattle sale receipt on the other. He stared at them for a very long time. He did his own math. He did it twice. He stood up. He walked to the filing cabinet in the mudroom. He pulled out a different map. It was a map of the East Quarter. 400 acres of prime heavy loam soil, the best dirt the Hayes family owned. He walked back to the table and laid the map down in front of Evelyn. "You need to order more wire," Silas said. "You're going to need a lot more wire." That was the victory. It was quiet. It was contained entirely within the walls of the farmhouse. But the world outside those walls is rarely convinced by a single anomaly. The fall of 2020 arrived and Evelyn expanded the operation. She bought 110 stocker steers. She built miles of temporary fencing across the East Quarter. Nature, however, has a cruel sense of humor. The farming season of 2020 to 2021 was an anomaly of a completely different kind. The rains came exactly when the wheat needed them. The winter was mild. Across Oak Haven County, the conventional wheat exploded. Fields that usually struggled to break 40 bushels an acre were suddenly projecting 60. It was a bumper crop of historic proportions. Evelyn's 400 acres grew well too. Her cattle gained weight, but the dual-purpose system requires the plant to recover from grazing. In a perfect weather year, an ungrazed plant will always outyield a grazed plant in sheer grain volume. When the harvest came in, Evelyn's fields averaged 52 bushels an acre, an incredible yield. But her neighbors farming the old way were pulling in 65. The nuance of the economics was lost on the town. They did not see the massive check Evelyn had already deposited from the sale of the cattle. All the county saw was that Silas Hayes' girl had grown 52 bushels, and the men who did it the right way had grown 65. Vance Corlin sat at the diner on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by men flush with cash from the bumper crop. Vance was smiling. "I told you boys not to worry about that girl," Vance said, his voice carrying over the clatter of silverware. "She had a lucky run on a dead patch of dirt last year. But you put a real crop year up against her little university theories, and you see what happens. She left 13 bushels an acre out in that field because she let cows chew on it. A good year makes fools look like geniuses until a great year proves them wrong." The men laughed. The threat of change was gone. Silas Hayes was still considered a man who had let his daughter play a costly game. Evelyn heard the whispers. She went home. She opened her spiral notebook. The math still held. The dual-purpose system was profoundly profitable. But it had not changed the county. It had only solidified their belief that she was an eccentric playing on her father's dime. "Let them see the grain," Evelyn said quietly to her father on the porch that night. "The land doesn't owe us a perfect year every year, Dad. When the perfect years stop, the ledger is all that's left to keep the bank away." The fall of 2021 started differently. There was no gentle rain. The September sky was a flat, unbroken blue. The dust hung in the air for hours after a truck passed. Evelyn bought her cattle, 140 head this time. She turned them out onto the winter wheat. The chutes were smaller this year. The soil was drier. By November, the whispers in town changed from boasting to a quiet, creeping anxiety. The wheat across Oak Haven County was struggling to establish. The winter was brutal with a dry, static cold that cracked the lips. Then came the spring of 2022. The rains simply did not arrive. May arrived with a terrifying, unseasonable heat. The wind blew constantly, acting like an invisible hairdryer aimed directly at the surface of the earth. It was a historic drought, the kind of drought that breaks generational farms in a matter of months. Across the county, the conventional winter wheat began to die. It was a slow, agonizing yellowing. By late May, fields that should have been waving seas of deep green were vast, brittle expanses of pale, sickly yellow. The panic set in. Vance Corlin's supply store was quiet. Farmers weren't buying fertilizer for a dead crop. They were walking into the bank asking for extensions they knew they wouldn't get. And then the collective gaze of Oak Haven County turned toward the Hayes farm. If the conventional wheat was dying, then Evelyn Hayes's wheat must surely be annihilated. She had turned 140 heavy animals loose on it all winter. In a drought, this severe a stressed plant dies first. Men drove their trucks slowly past the east quarter of the Hayes farm. They were looking for ruin. They wanted to see that the arrogant girl with her university notebook had failed worse than they had. But what they saw when they looked over the fence line made them stop their trucks. Evelyn Hayes's wheat was not yellow. It was a dark, muted olive color. It was short. It was undeniably suffering under the oppressive heat. But it was not dead. It was fighting. It was standing upright, the stalks refusing to buckle. It was the only green field in a 10-mile radius. And grazing right next to it on a section of native pasture she had leased for the spring were her 140 steers. They were massive. They were sleek. They were completely unbothered by the drought. Vance Corlin drove out to see it for himself. He parked his silver truck. He gripped the top wire of the fence. He stared at the dark olive wheat. He stared at the fat cattle. His jaw worked in silence. He could not find a way to explain it away as a fluke. You do not survive a historic drought by luck. Silas Hayes found Evelyn in the machine shed greasing the bearings on the combine. "Why is it alive?" E.B. Silas asked. "The whole county is burning to ash. Why is our crop standing?" Evelyn wiped her hands on a rag. She pulled her battered spiral notebook from her back pocket. She showed him a cross-section diagram of root structures. "It's the stress, Dad," she said. "When you plant conventional wheat and leave it alone, and the fall weather is decent, the plant gets lazy. It keeps its root system shallow right near the surface. But when I put the cattle on it in November, they graze off those top leaves. The plant panics. It senses a threat to its survival. So it redirects all of its energy downward. It drives its roots deep, seeking a permanent, secure water source to anchor itself." She pointed to the dark olive field standing defiant under the blazing sun. "Our roots are pulling moisture from the subsoil, moisture that hasn't seen the sun in 3 years. The cattle didn't hurt the crop, Dad. The cattle trained it to survive the end of the world." The June harvest of 2022 was a funeral procession for Oak Haven County. The county average yield plummeted to a catastrophic 12 bushels an acre. Most didn't even bother turning the key in the ignition. The Hayes farm ran their combine from dawn until midnight. The yield on the grazed east quarter was 31 bushels an acre. In a year where the market price had skyrocketed due to the regional failure, it was a gold mine. And when combined with the massive profit from selling 140 fat steers, the Hayes family was not just surviving. They were the most liquid, profitable operation within 200 miles. The isolation of the Hayes family shattered. Desperation overrides pride. The phone in the farmhouse began to ring. Men who had looked away from Silas in the diner now called late at night asking if Evelyn could explain the fencing. Evelyn did not gloat. She took her notebook. She drove to their farms. She explained the math. She gave away the knowledge freely, but the final reckoning had not yet occurred. It was late August. The Oak Haven County Agricultural Extension Office held its annual fall meeting in the gymnasium of the local high school. Every farmer who had a deed to his name was in that room. The extension agent stood at the podium. "We have asked Evelyn Hayes to speak tonight," the agent said, "to share the data on her dual-purpose grazing operation." The room went dead silent. 200 men watched as the 25-year-old woman stood up from the front row. Evelyn walked up the wooden steps to the stage. Sitting in the third row directly in the center, she saw Vance Corland. He was not smiling. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest. Evelyn opened the notebook. She did not give a speech about vindication. She spoke numbers. She laid out the data from 2019 to 2022. She explained the biological panic of the grazed plant, the downward drive of the root system. She showed them how forcing the land to work twice created an armor that a drought could not pierce. She spoke for 40 minutes. Nobody coughed. Nobody whispered. When she finished, she closed the notebook. The land doesn't care about our traditions, Evelyn said. It only responds to what we do to it today. Thank you. An old man in the back row slowly stood up. He brought his calloused hands together. It was a single loud clap, then another. Within 10 seconds, the entire gymnasium was on its feet. The applause was not a celebration. It was a surrender. It was the sound of a proud, stubborn community bowing to the undeniable weight of reality. Silas Hayes stood in the front row. He did not clap. He just watched his daughter, his chest tight with a pride so immense it threatened to crack his ribs. The meeting broke up. Slowly, the crowd thinned out until only a few people remained. Evelyn was packing her notebook when she heard heavy footsteps on the hardwood floor. She turned around. Vance Corlin stood 10 feet away. He reached up and took his expensive Stetson hat off his head. He held it in his hands, his fingers gripping the brim tightly. This was a man trying to dismantle a lifetime of pride in a single moment. I sat in my truck, Vance said, his voice rough. I sat on the county road and looked at your East Quarter in May. I wanted it to be dead, because if it was alive, it meant everything I believed I knew for 40 years was a lie. He took a step closer. I watched you build that fence on the Miller tract. I made sure the whole town laughed at you. I thought I was protecting the natural order of things. Vance looked at Silas, who was standing a few feet away. Vance nodded slowly to the older man, a gesture of profound respect. Then he looked back at Evelyn. I have a client, Vance said quietly. My biggest client. Henry Gable. He farms 2,000 acres up on the North Ridge. He followed my advice to the letter. The drought broke him. I can't save him, Evelyn. My chemicals can't save him. My pride almost killed him. He held out his hand, palm up, in a gesture of total submission. Will you come up to the North Ridge with me? Will you show us how to run the wire? Evelyn looked at the powerful man stripped of his armor. She could have twisted the knife. But Evelyn Hayes was forged from the earth, and the earth does not waste energy on revenge. It only focuses on what grows next. She picked up her bag. I'll need to see the soil test first, Mr. Corland, Evelyn said. And he'll need to buy his own fencing. I don't work on credit. Vance Corland stared at her for a long second. A slow, deeply relieved breath escaped his lungs. He nodded once. Thank you, he whispered. He turned and walked out of the gymnasium. Silas walked over to Evelyn. Let's go home, Evie, Silas said. The morning after this meeting in the high school gymnasium did not feel like a victory. Victory is a word for politicians and soldiers. For a farmer, the morning after survival only means there is a new day of work to be done. The sun still rose over Oak Haven County with the same pale, indifferent light. The wind still scraped across the tin roof of the machine shed, carrying the dry, familiar scent of dust and diesel exhaust. But inside the Hayes farmhouse, the air had fundamentally changed. The suffocating, invisible pressure that had occupied the corners of the rooms for 3 years was gone. Silas Hayes stood at the kitchen counter. He poured a cup of black coffee. He did not look at the heavy steel drawer of the filing cabinet in the mudroom. He did not need to. The bank letter that had haunted his waking hours and ruined his sleep was no longer a threat. It was just a piece of paper. The ledger on the kitchen table, written in his daughter's precise handwriting, had rendered it powerless. Evelyn walked into the kitchen. She wore the same faded canvas jacket, the same scuffed leather boots. She poured her own coffee. She did not look like a savior. She looked like a woman who had a fence to check on the East Quarter. They stood in silence, watching the pale light spill across the linoleum floor. I'll be taking the truck up to the North Ridge today, Evelyn said quietly. Silas took a slow sip of his coffee. Vance Corland's client. Henry Gable, Evelyn nodded. 2,000 acres of dead conventional wheat. He's going to have to drill a cover crop just to keep his topsoil from blowing into the next state. Then we figure out the fencing. Silas looked out the window. Henry Gable was a proud man. He was a man who had built an empire on chemical fertilizer and deep tillage. Taking direction from a 25-year-old woman was going to be a bitter pill for a man like Gable to swallow. He'll fight you, Silas said. Men like that, they don't know how to surrender until the bank has the padlocks on the gates. He doesn't have to like it, Evelyn said, setting her mug down. He just has to do it. The dirt doesn't care about his pride. Silas watched his daughter walk out the door, the screen slamming shut behind her. He felt a deep, resonant ache in his chest, not of pain but of profound realization. She was no longer just his daughter. She was a force of nature. She had taken the worst hand the county could deal, and she had played it with a cold, unrelenting discipline that had broken the will of the hardest men in Kansas. An hour later, Silas put on his jacket. He started his truck and drove the long, straight county road into town. It was Saturday morning. The diner was full. The gravel parking lot was packed with heavy trucks coated in the brown dust of a failed harvest. Silas killed the engine. He sat in the cab for a long moment, his hands resting on the worn steering wheel. He remembered the last time he had walked into this diner. He remembered the silence. He remembered the averted eyes. He remembered the unbearable humiliation of being a man stripped of his standing in the only place he had ever called home. He opened the door. He stepped out into the wind. He walked up the concrete steps and pushed open the heavy glass door. The bell above the door jingled. The diner was a cacophony of clinking silverware, low conversations, and the smell of fried bacon. As Silas stepped across the threshold, the noise did not stop abruptly, but a ripple moved through the room. Men looked up from their plates. In the back booth, surrounded by three other large farm owners, sat Vance Corland. Vance looked up. He saw Silas standing by the door. For a span of 5 seconds, the entire history of Oak Haven County seemed to hang suspended in the air. The old ways and the new reality stared at each other across a room of scuffed linoleum and vinyl booths. Vance Corland placed his coffee mug on the table. He did not smile. This was not a moment for casual pleasantries. This was a moment of formal public reckoning. Vance pushed himself out of the booth. He stood up to his full height. He looked at the men sitting with him, then he looked at the empty chair at the head of their table. He reached out with a heavy manicured hand and pulled the chair out. He looked across the room directly into Silas Hayes' eyes. "Silas," Vance said. His voice was calm, carrying easily over the ambient noise of the diner. "We've got a spare seat. Coffee's hot." The men in the booth shifted, making room. The men at the counter watched. The waitress stopped wiping down the counter. It was the ultimate concession. It was the absolute restoration of the Hayes name. In the rigid, unspoken hierarchy of rural America, Vance Corland was publicly stating that Silas Hayes was not just a peer, but a man owed a deep and profound respect. Silas did not hesitate. He did not shrink, and he did not strut. He walked across the diner with the steady, measured gait of a man who knows exactly what his land is worth. He reached the booth. He nodded once to Vance. He sat down in the offered chair. The waitress hurried over and poured a fresh cup of coffee, leaving the pot on the table. Vance sat back down. He looked at the black liquid in his mug. "She's up at Gable's place this morning," Vance said quietly, not looking up. Silas took a sip of his coffee. He tasted the bitter, familiar roast. "She is. Henry is a stubborn old mule." Vance said, a faint, humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. "He called me at midnight, pacing the floor. He told me he'd rather sell the farm than run a wire across his fields and let cattle chew on his dirt." Silas set his mug down. "What did you tell him, Vance?" Vance finally looked up. His eyes were heavy, carrying the exhaustion of a man who had spent the last 48 hours dismantling his own ego. "I told him he could either let the girl string the wire or he could start packing his boxes. I told him my chemicals burned his crop to a crisp, and her cattle were the only things fat enough to survive the summer. I told him he didn't have the luxury of pride anymore. None of us do." The other men at the table remained silent. They were listening, absorbing the tectonic shift in the county's power structure. Silas nodded slowly. "She'll get it done. The dirt doesn't care if Henry Gable is stubborn." Out on the North Ridge, the wind was tearing across 2,000 acres of absolute devastation. Henry Gable stood next to his massive $250,000 four-wheel drive tractor. The machine was immaculate, a testament to agricultural power and wealth. But the land it sat upon was a tragedy. The soil was a pale, lifeless gray, cracked into deep fissures. When the wind blew, entire sheets of topsoil lifted into the air and vanished. It was a farm that had been chemically strip-mined for 3 decades, stripped of its organic armor, and left completely defenseless against the drought. Evelyn's battered truck pulled up next to the massive tractor. She stepped out, pulling a heavy spool of high-tensile polywire from the bed. Henry Gable was 68 years old. He looked at the young woman. He looked at her scuffed boots and the notebook in her pocket. His face was a mask of tight, controlled anger. He was a man who had commanded respect his entire life, And now he was standing in the ruins of his empire, waiting for a 25-year-old to tell him how to save it. "You're the Hayes girl," Henry said. His voice was like grinding stones. "I'm Evelyn," she replied, dropping the heavy spool onto the dry dirt. "Vance tells me I have to listen to you. Tells me you have some magic trick with cattle and string that's going to fix 2,000 acres of dead wheat." "It's not magic," Mr. Gable, Evelyn said, meeting his hard gaze without a trace of intimidation. "It's biology, and I can't fix the dead wheat. That crop is gone. What I can do is stop your topsoil from blowing into Nebraska, rebuild your organic matter, and give you a chance to plant a viable crop next season." Henry looked out over the desolate landscape. "I've farmed this ground for 50 years. I know this dirt." "You knew this dirt when it had rain," Evelyn corrected him gently. "You knew it when fertilizer was cheap. You don't know it in a crisis. You've treated the soil like a sponge that just holds chemicals. But soil is alive. It's a biological system. You've starved the biology, and when the drought hit, the system collapsed." Henry's jaw tightened. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at the spool of wire. "And some white string and a herd of cows is going to bring it back to life." "Yes," Evelyn said simply. "We drill a diverse cover crop cocktail immediately. Radishes, turnips, rye, and vetch. We pray for a fraction of an inch of rain to get it germinated. When it's ankle high, we bring in 400 head of cattle. We don't let them roam. We use this wire. We confine them to tight paddocks. Ultra-high density grazing. We move them twice a day. They trample the cover crop into the dirt. They cover the ground with manure and urine, and their hooves break the hardpan. They will inoculate your dead soil with biology. They will build the armor you need to hold the moisture for next year." Henry Gable stared at her. He was looking for hesitation. He was looking for a crack in her confidence. He found nothing but cold, absolute certainty. "It'll take miles of wire," Henry muttered, the fight slowly draining out of him. "I don't have the manpower to move cattle twice a day across 2,000 acres." A silver truck pulled down the dirt road, trailing a cloud of dust. It pulled up alongside Evelyn's truck. The door opened. Vance Corlin stepped out. He was wearing work boots, heavy denim jeans, and a canvas jacket. He did not look like the owner of the county's largest supply business. He looked like a hired hand. He walked to the bed of Evelyn's truck, reached in, and pulled out a heavy steel post pounder. He walked over to Henry Gable. "You have the manpower," Henry Vance said, hefting the heavy steel tool onto his shoulder. "You've got me. I sold you the poison that killed this dirt. I'm going to help you drive the post to bring it back." Henry stared at his oldest friend. He saw the genuine remorse, the total dismantling of ego. Henry looked down at the cracked, lifeless earth beneath his expensive boots. He looked at the young woman who had survived the apocalypse. He looked at the spool of wire. Henry reached out. He grabbed the heavy spool. "Show me where the first corner goes," Henry said. For the next 2 months, the North Ridge became a theater of brutal, unrelenting labor. Evelyn, Vance, and Henry worked from before dawn until long after the stars came out. They drilled the cover crop into the dust. By a stroke of unmerited grace, a weak scattered thunderstorm rolled across the northern edge of the county in late September, dropping just enough moisture to trigger germination. Faint, desperately fragile lines of green appeared in the gray dirt. They hauled the wire. They drove thousands of fiberglass posts into the hardpan. Vance Corland, a man who had not done manual labor in 3 decades, swung the post pounder until his hands were raw and blistered, until his shoulders screamed in agony. He did not complain. He worked with the grim determination of a man performing penance. Henry Gable learned to measure grass. He learned to estimate dry matter intake. He learned to look at the soil not as a holding tank for chemicals, but as a living organism that required rest and recovery. When the 400 head of cattle arrived, Evelyn orchestrated the movement. It was a massive moving wave of biology. The cattle were packed tight, shoulder to shoulder, behind the electrified wire. They grazed aggressively, trampling the remaining cover crop flat against the earth, covering the soil, creating a protective layer of armor against the sun and the wind. Every 12 hours, they dropped the wire and moved the herd forward. The land behind them was transformed. It was covered in manure, trampled plant matter, and biological activity. It was chaotic, messy, and incredibly beautiful to a trained eye. Winter fell over Kansas cold and hard. But the mood in Oak Haven County had fundamentally shifted. The despair that had gripped the community in June was gone. It was replaced by a quiet, fierce determination to adapt. The Extension Office bulletin that Patrice Jensen had written, based entirely on Evelyn's spiral notebook, became the most read document in the county. Farmers sat at their kitchen tables under the yellow glow of overhead lamps, doing the math, drawing paddock maps, calculating wire costs. The local bank, which had been preparing for a wave of foreclosures, suddenly found itself fielding requests for loans to buy portable water tanks and solar fence energizers. The banker's men, who historically only trusted grain receipts, drove out to look at the Hayes farm. They saw the dark, resilient soil. They saw the ledger. The capital began to flow in a new direction. The spring of 2023 arrived. The drought had broken, though the rains were still sparse. But the land that had been managed with the new philosophy responded differently. Henry Gable's North Ridge, which had been a blowing desert the year before, held the spring moisture in its newly formed organic armor. He planted a crop of dryland sorghum. It germinated beautifully. When Vance Corlin drove out to check the stand, he did not bring a catalog of chemical fertilizers. He brought a shovel. He dug into the dirt. He found earthworms. He found moisture 3 inches below the surface. He stood in the field and wept a quiet, private shedding of tears for the years he had spent fighting the very earth he thought he was protecting. On the Hayes farm, Silas walked the land with a lighter step. The crushing weight of generational debt was completely eradicated. The farm was highly profitable, incredibly resilient, and deeply alive. It was a late afternoon in October 2024. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of turning leaves. Silas sat on the front porch of the farmhouse, whittling a piece of soft pine with a pocket knife. A truck turned up the long driveway. It wasn't Evelyn's battered rig. It was a slightly newer truck covered in the white dust of the Flint Hills. The truck parked near the porch. The door opened and Wyatt Hayes stepped out. Wyatt was 20 years old. He possessed the same lean, raw-boned build as his father and the same quiet, calculating eyes as his sister. He had been gone for 2 years, working as a hired hand on a massive progressive cattle ranch in the rocky, unforgiving terrain of eastern Kansas. He had left a boy looking for an escape from a dying farm. He returned a man forged by hard work and observation. He walked up the steps to the porch. He dropped a heavy canvas duffel bag onto the wooden floorboards. Silas closed his pocket knife. He looked up at his son. "You're home," Silas said. "I'm home, Dad," Wyatt replied. They did not hug. They did not make a scene. The deep, unspoken current of blood and land flowed between them, requiring no grand gestures. Evelyn walked around the corner of the house. She had a smudge of grease on her cheek and a pair of fencing pliers in her hand. She stopped when she saw her brother. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face. "You look like you've been working for a living," Evelyn said. Wyatt smiled back. "I learned a few things out in the rocks." That evening, the kitchen felt full for the first time in years. Martha had cooked a massive roast. The smell filled the house, a scent of warmth and security. They ate in companionable silence, the clatter of silverware the only sound. When the plates were cleared, Silas poured coffee. Wyatt did not immediately speak. He reached into his canvas coat, which was draped over the back of his chair. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. He laid it flat on the kitchen table right in the center, under the yellow glow of the overhead light. Silas looked at the folder. He felt a sudden, intense wave of déjà vu. He remembered a morning 5 years ago, the bank letter, the spiral notebook, the fear. Evelyn looked at the folder. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "What do you have there, Wyatt?" Wyatt opened the leather cover. Inside were meticulously drawn maps of the native pasture ground on the far south end of the Hayes farm. Ground that had always been left alone, grazed continuously and lazily by the herd during the summer months. "I've been reading this data on mob grazing," Wyatt said. His voice was steady, respectful, but pulsing with an underlying excitement. Ultra-high density, short-duration grazing on native perennial grasses. We're talking 1/4 of an acre at a time. Move them 4 times a day. You get a massive trampling effect, incredible manure distribution, and you let the grass rest for 100 days before you touch it again. He slid a page of calculations across the table toward Evelyn. The research shows it drastically increases the water infiltration rate of the soil. It pushes deep taproots on the native warm-season grasses. It sequesters carbon at a rate that traditional grazing can't touch. You prove the dual-purpose system on the cropland EV. You save the farm. But our native pastures are underperforming. They're tired. If we apply the mob grazing principles to the south pastures, we can increase our carrying capacity by 40% in 3 years without buying a single acre of new land. Silas sat back in his chair. He looked at the maps. He looked at the numbers. He looked at his son, who was vibrating with the same intense data-driven passion that had consumed Evelyn 5 years ago. Silas looked across the table at Evelyn. Evelyn was staring at the folder. She saw the calculations. She saw the ambition. But more importantly, she felt the profound shift in the dynamics of the room. 5 years ago, she had sat in this exact chair, an outcast fighting a desperate war against her father's fear and the county's prejudice. She had been the rebel. She had been the anomaly. She had fought tooth and nail just to be allowed to try. Now she looked at Wyatt. He was not fighting prejudice. He was not fighting fear. He was bringing a new innovation to a table that had already been fundamentally changed. He was building on the foundation she had laid. She realized with a quiet, overwhelming sense of peace that she was no longer the rebel. She was the institution. She was the new tradition of the Hayes farm. Evelyn reached out and pulled the folder closer to her. She looked at the fencing schematics Wyatt had drawn. She traced the lines with her finger. She thought about the early mornings, the frozen water buckets, the laughter on the county road, the sheer crushing terror of the flash freeze. She thought about Vance Corlin swinging a post-pounder in the dust. She thought about what it cost to be the first one through the wall. It cost everything. But looking at her brother, seeing the clear, unburdened path laid out before him, she knew it had been worth every single drop of blood and sweat. The land was safe, the family was whole, and the knowledge had been passed down. Evelyn looked up from the folder. She met her brother's eyes. "Show me the soil test baselines," Evelyn said. Her voice was calm, authoritative, the voice of a master speaking to an apprentice. "We need to know our starting organic matter percentage before we calculate the stocking density." Wyatt's face broke into a massive grin. He reached into the folder and pulled out a stack of lab reports. "I pulled the cores last week. I had them sent to the university." Silas Hayes picked up his coffee mug. He took a long, slow sip. He did not need to understand the intricate biology of the soil tests. He did not need to read the academic papers on carbon sequestration. He looked around his kitchen. He saw his daughter, the savior of his name, poring over data. He saw his son, the future of the land, eager to push the boundaries of what the dirt could do. He thought about his grandfather breaking the sod in 1931, with a team of horses and a plow, fighting the wind and the dust, with nothing but raw muscle and blind hope. The tools had changed. The science had changed. The climate was growing harder and more unforgiving every year. But the core element, the essential spirit required to survive on the American prairie, remained exactly the same. It required the quiet courage to face the unknown. It required the discipline to do the brutal, unglamorous work when nobody was watching. And it required the profound humility to listen to the land rather than trying to dictate terms to it. Silas stood up from the table. The conversation between Evelyn and Wyatt continued, a rapid-fire exchange of agricultural theory and practical application. Silas walked into the mudroom. He opened the heavy steel drawer of the filing cabinet. It was no longer filled with warnings of foreclosure or anxious calculations of impending ruin. It held clean ledgers, high-yield grain receipts, and the deeds to the land owned free and clear. On the top of the cabinet, resting securely, was Evelyn's original battered spiral notebook. The cover was stained with grease dirt and dried rain. The corners were curled. It was a holy relic of the Hayes farm. Silas reached out and touched the cover. His rough, calloused fingers lingered on the worn cardboard. He turned and looked back through the doorway into the bright, warm kitchen. The voices of his children filled the space, vibrating with life and purpose. The wind outside was picking up, howling around the eaves of the old farmhouse. It was the same wind that had blown across Oak Haven County for a millennium. It was the wind that tore the weak from the soil and polished the strong until they shone like stone. Silas smiled, a deep, quiet smile that barely moved his lips but reached all the way to his eyes. Let it blow, he thought. The dirt was safe, the roots were deep, and the house would stand.